Imagine surviving breast cancer, believing the hardest battle of your life was finally behind you, only to spend your last savings on a forgotten medicinal garden that everyone else called worthless. That's exactly what happened to Hannah Brooks at 42 after losing her career, her marriage, and nearly her life. She bought an abandoned herb garden for just $250. The neighbors laughed. They said she'd traded a second chance at life for a patch of weeds and a collapsing cottage. Even the auctioneer seemed relieved someone had taken the property off his hands. But as Hannah began clearing the dust-covered floor inside the old garden shed, she uncovered something no one had seen in decades. A hidden wooden box containing a mysterious journal known only as the Lost Healer's Journal. What she read inside would completely change everything she believed about the garden and about the woman who had once cared for it. But before we open that forgotten journal together, I'd love to know where you're listening from today and what time it is where you are. Leave your city, country, and local time in the comments so we can see how far this story travels around the world. If you're listening in the morning, I wish you a wonderful day ahead. If it's evening, I hope this story helps you relax. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten inheritances, hidden family legacies, and life-changing discoveries, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey. Now, let's discover what was hidden inside that forgotten journal. Hannah Brooks had once believed surviving breast cancer would feel like crossing a finish line. Instead, it felt as though someone had erased the map and left her standing alone at 42. She no longer recognized the life she had spent nearly 2 decades building. During the months of chemotherapy and surgery, her position as a marketing executive had quietly disappeared into corporate restructuring. Friends who had promised to stay close had slowly faded into occasional holiday messages. Her marriage, already strained by years of long workdays and postponed dreams, finally ended 6 months after her treatment. Neither she nor her former husband blamed the illness alone. Cancer had simply forced them to admit they wanted different futures. When the divorce papers arrived, Hannah folded them carefully, placed them in a drawer, and realized she felt less anger than exhaustion. She had survived the disease that doctors once warned might take her life, yet she had no idea what kind of life remained waiting for her. Every morning she woke, grateful to be alive, but by evening she often wondered what she was supposed to do with that second chance. The apartment she rented in the city no longer felt like home. It reminded her of hospital appointments, traffic, deadlines, and a version of herself who had believed every hour needed to be productive. One rainy Saturday, while drinking coffee beside the window, she noticed a notice in the local newspaper announcing a county auction for abandoned rural properties. Most listings described neglected barns, empty lots, or collapsed sheds. One listing, almost hidden near the bottom of the page, caught her attention. Former medicinal herb garden with cottage, as-is condition. The starting price was $250. Hannah smiled at the absurdity. She knew almost nothing about medicinal plants. She had never owned more than a single potted herb on her apartment balcony, and even that had died after a business trip. Yet something about the description lingered in her thoughts throughout the weekend. The following Tuesday, she drove nearly 2 hours into the countryside, telling herself she was only curious. The auction drew a small crowd of farmers, contractors, and local investors. Most people ignored the herb garden listing, focusing instead on larger parcels of farmland. When the auctioneer finally announced the neglected property, he sounded almost relieved. "Old Holloway Place," he said. "Medicinal garden, abandoned cottage, approximately 4 acres. Needs considerable work." A few people laughed quietly. One man whispered that the weeds were probably worth more than the land itself. Another joked that anyone buying it would spend more on clearing vines than the property would ever be worth. Hannah stood near the back, listening. She had promised herself she would only observe. But as the auctioneer looked around for bids and received only silence, an unexpected thought entered her mind. What if starting over did not require certainty? What if it only required one small decision? She raised her hand. 250? The auctioneer blinked. $250? Any higher bids? No one answered. A woman near the front shook her head and smiled sympathetically at Hannah, as though she had just made an expensive mistake. Sold! The wooden hammer struck the podium. Several people congratulated Hannah politely, though their expressions suggested pity more than admiration. One older farmer chuckled as he passed. "Hope you like pulling weeds." Hannah laughed with him. Secretly, she wondered whether she had just made the most irresponsible purchase of her life. By late afternoon, she followed the county map to the property. A weathered wooden sign barely visible beneath climbing ivy still read, "Holloway Medicinal Garden." The gravel driveway had almost disappeared beneath grass. Wildflowers and waist-high weeds covered what had once been carefully arranged planting beds. Fruit trees leaned beneath years of neglected branches. The cottage itself stood small but sturdy, its stone chimney still intact despite peeling paint and cracked shutters. It looked tired rather than ruined. Hannah unlocked the front door with the key provided by the county office. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight. The rooms were simple. A kitchen with worn wooden cabinets, a modest bedroom, a sitting room lined with empty shelves, and a tiny workroom overlooking the overgrown garden. Nothing inside suggested hidden wealth. Most furniture had already been removed years earlier. Even so, the cottage felt strangely peaceful. She opened the back door and stepped into the garden. The air carried the fragrance of damp earth mixed with herbs she could not identify. Although tangled by neglect, many plants still grew in organized rows beneath the weeds. Someone had once cared deeply for this place. As Hannah wandered slowly between the overgrown beds, she heard the sound of pruning shears. An elderly man stood several rows away, trimming dead branches from a neglected apple tree that appeared to sit just beyond the property line. He noticed her and lifted a hand in greeting. "You must be the new owner." "I suppose I am," Hannah replied. "I'm Hannah Brooks." "Ethan Miller." He crossed the narrow fence with an easy familiarity. "I was Grace Holloway's neighbor for more years than I can count." Hannah recognized the name from the auction notice. "Did you know her well?" "Well enough to know she'd be pleased someone finally came back." He looked across the neglected beds with quiet affection rather than sadness. Most people only saw weeds. Hannah admitted she knew almost nothing about medicinal plants. Ethan smiled. "Grace always said gardens teach patient people." He noticed Hannah studying several tangled patches near the cottage. "One piece of advice?" "I'd appreciate that." Ethan's expression grew unexpectedly serious. "Don't rush to clean everything." Hannah glanced toward the weeds. "You mean because some of these are herbs?" "Partly." He looked toward the old shed standing behind the cottage. "Mostly because Grace never left anything where it didn't belong." Hannah followed his gaze. The small wooden shed leaned slightly with age but remained standing. Its windows were too dusty to see inside. Ethan picked up his basket of trimmed branches before returning to his own property. He repeated his advice more quietly. "Whatever you do, don't pull anything until you've looked carefully." Hannah watched him disappear beyond the trees. The words stayed with her as evening settled across the garden. She decided to begin with the cottage instead. After sweeping the main rooms, she carried several broken crates from the shed into the yard. The building smelled of cedar, dried herbs, and old soil. Gardening tools hung neatly from rusted hooks. Empty clay pots filled one wall. Near the back stood a sturdy wooden workbench, coated in dust, As Hannah swept beneath it, the broom struck the floor with a dull, hollow sound, unlike the rest of the boards. She stopped, knelt, and brushed away decades of dust with her hand. Between two worn planks, she noticed the faint outline of a perfectly square wooden panel concealed beneath the floorboards. Hannah barely slept that night. Long after darkness settled over the abandoned medicinal garden, she kept thinking about the hollow sound beneath the shed floor and Ethan Miller's quiet warning not to rush. By sunrise, she carried a flashlight, a pry bar, and a screwdriver into the old shed. The morning air smelled of damp soil and wild herbs, warming beneath the first sunlight. Dust covered every surface, but the square outline she had uncovered the evening before was still clearly visible beneath the workbench. She knelt carefully and slipped the flat edge of the pry bar into the narrow seam. The panel resisted at first, then lifted with a slow groan of old wood. Beneath it rested a shallow compartment no larger than a suitcase. Inside lay a weathered cedar box wrapped in faded linen cloth. Hannah lifted it gently onto the workbench. A brass clasp, darkened with age, held the lid shut, but was not locked. She hesitated only a moment before opening it. Inside rested a single leather-bound journal, several dried lavender sprigs, and a folded piece of linen protecting the book from moisture. The leather cover had cracked with time, yet someone had cared enough to oil it years earlier. Embossed across the front in worn gold letters were two simple words: Healer's Journal. Hannah carefully opened the first page. In neat handwriting, she found a date from more than 40 years earlier, followed by the name Grace Holloway. The next lines listed herbs she had never heard of, beside common plants she recognized from grocery stores or kitchen windowsills. Lavender, lemon balm, echinacea, calendula, chamomile. Each entry included careful notes about planting seasons, weather, harvesting times, drying methods, and traditional uses. Hannah smiled to herself. She had expected forgotten family stories, or perhaps property records. Instead, she appeared to be holding nothing more mysterious than the notebook of an experienced gardener. She turned another page. The format changed. A date appeared first, followed by a person's name, a description of their condition, the herbs Grace prepared, and short notes written several weeks later. Mrs. Evelyn Hart, sleepless after her husband's passing. Lemon balm tea each evening. Returned smiling after 14 days. Another page described a child recovering strength after a long illness. Another recorded a farmer whose hands had healed enough to return to work after weeks of herbal salves and careful rest. None of the entries sounded dramatic. They felt practical, compassionate, and deeply personal. Hannah frowned thoughtfully. These were not medical records in any formal sense. They were observations made by someone who genuinely cared whether her neighbors recovered. She continued reading until footsteps approached outside the shed. Ethan appeared in the doorway, carrying a basket filled with freshly picked apples. "Thought you might need breakfast," he said before noticing the open cedar box. His expression changed immediately. "Where did you find that?" Hannah pointed toward the open compartment beneath the floor. Ethan slowly set the basket aside and walked closer. For several moments, he simply stared at the journal without touching it. "I haven't seen that book since Grace passed away," he said quietly. "You know it?" "Know it?" He smiled sadly. "I watched her write in it for years." Hannah gently turned the cover so he could see the title. "It looks like gardening notes mixed with stories about local people." Ethan nodded. Grace never called herself a doctor. Folks came because she listened. Sometimes herbs helped. Sometimes they mostly needed kindness and someone willing to sit with them. He carefully turned a few pages without disturbing the fragile paper. She recorded everything: weather, plants, harvests, how people were recovering. Hannah looked around the overgrown garden outside the open doorway. Did she teach anyone before she died? Ethan shook his head. She hoped she would have time. Silence settled between them. Hannah glanced back at the journal. I don't even know the names of half these plants. You can learn. Ethan smiled gently. Grace believed gardens taught anyone willing to pay attention. As he prepared to leave, he paused beside the workbench. Take good care of that journal. Around here, people thought it disappeared years ago. After Ethan returned home, Hannah spent the afternoon reading while sitting beneath the shade of an old apple tree. Every few pages, she walked into the garden trying to match the sketches in the journal with the plants growing among the weeds. She quickly realized how little she knew. Some herbs remained easy to recognize because Grace had drawn detailed leaves beside their names. Those had spread naturally until their original borders disappeared. Still, Hannah resisted the temptation to clear everything away. Ethan's advice made more sense with every page she read. The neglected garden was not empty. It was simply waiting to be understood. Late that afternoon, the sound of a vehicle interrupted the peaceful silence. A dark SUV stopped beside the front gate. A well-dressed man stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. He introduced himself with a practiced smile. Richard Cole. Hannah shook his hand politely. Can I help you? I understand you recently purchased this property. Yesterday. Richard looked around the overgrown garden with the measured expression of someone calculating possibilities rather than admiring them. You acquired it at an excellent price. That's one way to describe it. He smiled. I'm a local investor. I've assembled several neighboring properties over the past few years. This parcel would complete a larger development. Hannah folded her arms. What kind of development? A countryside wellness destination. Boutique cottages, landscape gardens, event spaces. He spoke confidently, as though the future already existed. I'd like to save you months of difficult restoration. He removed a document from his portfolio. I'm prepared to offer considerably more than you paid. Hannah glanced toward the abandoned herb beds, then back at the journal resting safely inside the cottage. 24 hours earlier, she might have accepted without hesitation. She had bought the property on impulse. Selling immediately would produce an easy profit and erase any financial risk. Yet something inside her resisted. She looked again at the rows of forgotten plants still surviving beneath years of neglect. I appreciate the offer, she said, handing the paper back unopened. But I'm not selling. Richard's smile remained polite, though noticeably thinner. Perhaps after you've had more time to see how much work this place requires. Perhaps, Hannah answered, but not today. He accepted the refusal gracefully, wished her luck, and drove away. As evening approached, Hannah carried the journal back into the cottage and resumed reading where she had left off. Near the center of the book, the handwriting suddenly stopped in the middle of a sentence. She turned the page. Nothing followed. Instead, she found jagged edges where several sheets had been carefully removed. She counted again. More than a dozen pages had been cut cleanly from the journal, leaving only empty spaces between the remaining entries. The missing pages stayed on Hannah's mind long after she closed the journal that evening. Whoever had removed them had done so with care. The cuts were straight, deliberate, and made with a sharp blade rather than by accident. She resisted the urge to imagine hidden fortunes or impossible secrets. Everything she had read so far suggested Grace Holloway had lived a practical life rooted in patience, kindness, and quiet work. Whatever had once filled those missing pages, it probably mattered because of the people they described, not because it promised wealth. The next morning, Hannah photographed several pages of the journal before driving into town. Ethan had mentioned that if anyone could identify the unusual plants growing in the abandoned beds, it would be Dr. Maya Chen, a botanist who worked with native medicinal species at the Regional Botanical Research Center. The building was modest, surrounded by demonstration gardens and small greenhouses rather than large laboratories. Hannah introduced herself at the reception desk and was surprised when Maya agreed to meet her that same afternoon. Dr. Maya Chen welcomed Hannah into a bright workroom lined with drying racks, pressed plant specimens, and shelves filled with carefully labeled reference books. She appeared to be in her late 30s, wearing gardening gloves tucked into the pocket of her lab coat instead of carrying them in a drawer. Hannah placed printed photographs of several journal pages on the table. Maya studied them silently for several moments before smiling with genuine interest. "These notes are remarkable. You can actually read them?" Hannah asked. "Very easily. Grace Holloway had excellent field habits. She recorded weather, soil conditions, flowering times, harvesting dates, and preparation methods more carefully than many professional researchers." Hannah admitted she knew almost nothing about herbs. Maya pointed to one of Grace's sketches. "This is calendula. Most people would harvest the flowers as quickly as possible. Grace waited until specific stages because she believed healthier plants continued serving the garden for years rather than one season." She turned another page. "Notice something else. She almost never writes about taking from the garden without mentioning how she cared for it afterward." Hannah looked more closely. Maya was right. Nearly every harvest entry included notes about replanting, dividing roots, collecting seeds, improving soil, or allowing sections to rest before gathering again. Grace treated the garden as something to preserve rather than simply use. "She wasn't just growing herbs," Maya said quietly. "She was maintaining a living community of plants." Hannah found herself thinking about her own life before illness. She had spent years measuring success by deadlines, promotions, and quarterly results. Grace's journal reflected an entirely different philosophy. Care came before productivity. Continuity mattered more than speed. Before Hannah left, Maya offered practical advice. "Don't clear the weeds all at once. Many medicinal plants protect themselves by growing among ordinary species. Remove everything too quickly, and you could destroy what you're trying to save." Back at the property, Hannah carried a notebook into the garden and began working slowly. Comparing Grace's sketches with the living plants around her, she marked rows with small wooden stakes instead of pulling vegetation immediately. Lavender emerged from beneath tangled grass. Lemon balm spread beneath blackberry runners. Chamomile still flowered along the edge of an old stone path, almost hidden beneath moss. Every hour revealed another forgotten section of the original layout. The work was slow, but unlike the exhausting pace of her former career, she found herself enjoying the deliberate rhythm. Late in the afternoon, Ethan wandered over, carrying a watering can. "Looks different already," he said. Hannah smiled. "Mostly because I'm finally seeing what's here." Together they walked between the marked rows. Ethan occasionally identified a tree Grace had planted or pointed toward an empty space where a medicinal shrub had once grown. Near the back of the property, he stopped beside a weathered stone marker almost completely hidden beneath ivy. "This used to divide the main garden," he said. Hannah brushed away leaves until a faint carved symbol appeared on the top surface. It resembled the same small leaf Grace had drawn beside several journal entries. Curious. Hannah opened the journal to compare them. As she gently turned the pages, a folded piece of yellowed paper slipped from between two sections near the back of the book. She was certain it had not fallen out before. Carefully unfolding it, she discovered a hand-drawn map of the property. Unlike the simple layout she had been imagining, the map showed individual planting beds arranged with surprising precision. Small handwritten notes labeled drying areas, seed plots, orchard trees, and the cottage. Maya's observation suddenly made sense. Grace had organized the entire landscape as a carefully balanced system. Ethan leaned closer. I haven't seen that map before. Hannah traced one narrow path leading behind the orchard. Most of the markings matched places they could still recognize despite years of neglect. Then her finger stopped near the edge of the drawing. Beyond the last visible herb beds, separated by a line of trees, Grace had sketched another enclosed section. Unlike every other label, this one contained only 2 handwritten words surrounded by a simple border. Second Garden. Hannah studied the hand-drawn map until the fading light made the pencil lines difficult to see. The path to the second garden began behind the orchard, past the old stone marker, and continued beyond a narrow row of trees that appeared to form the property boundary. Ethan looked toward the darkening woods and suggested they wait until morning. Hannah agreed, though curiosity followed her back to the cottage and kept her awake long after sunset. At dawn, she packed gloves, water, pruning shears, the copied map, and Grace's journal into a canvas bag. Ethan met her beside the orchard, carrying a small saw and a walking stick, polished smooth by years of use. The route was harder to follow than the map suggested. Blackberry vines had swallowed the original footpath, fallen branches blocked several sections, and young trees had grown where open ground once existed. Hannah moved slowly, comparing the shapes of the orchard and stone walls with Grace's careful drawing. At one point, the path seemed to disappear completely beneath a dense thicket. Ethan pushed aside several branches and uncovered a line of flat stones hidden under moss. Grace laid these herself, he said. I helped carry some of them when I was younger. You knew this path existed? Hannah asked. I knew she worked beyond the orchard. She rarely invited anyone farther. He sounded troubled by the admission. I assumed the area had returned to woodland. They followed the stones until the trees opened around a small clearing enclosed by a low wooden fence, nearly concealed beneath climbing vines. A narrow gate leaned sideways on one hinge. Beyond it, raised planting beds formed a careful circle around a stone basin. Unlike the main garden, this place had been protected from the worst of the overgrowth. Taller trees sheltered it from wind, and layers of fallen leaves had kept the soil moist. Plants still grew in organized clusters, some weak and tangled, others surprisingly strong. Hannah stepped through the broken gate and felt the atmosphere change. The garden was quieter than the land surrounding it, as though the trees had been holding their breath for years. Ethan stopped beside the first bed. I haven't been here since Grace was alive. Hannah opened the journal and searched the later entries for sketches that matched the unfamiliar leaves around them. Several plants were marked with stars, indicating that Grace considered them difficult to establish. Others had notes about conserving seeds or harvesting only small amounts. Hannah photographed each section before touching anything. She recognized echinacea, valerian, and St. John's wort from Maya's explanations. But several plants remained unknown to her. One low-growing herb with silver leaves appeared repeatedly in the garden's central beds. Another climbed a small wooden trellis that had somehow survived years of weather. These must have mattered to her, Hannah said. Ethan nodded. Grace protected this place more carefully than the rest. Near the center stood a weathered bench facing the stone basin beneath it. Hannah noticed one plank that seemed newer than the others. She knelt and found a small metal ring fixed underneath. When she pulled, a narrow compartment opened inside the bench. A rusted tin box rested within. The lid had been sealed with wax around the edges, protecting it from moisture. Ethan used the tip of his knife to loosen the seal. Inside lay several packets of seeds wrapped in paper, a bundle of dried leaves, and a folded letter addressed simply to whoever finds this garden. Hannah unfolded it carefully. Grace's handwriting was the same steady script that filled the journal. If you have reached the second garden, the letter began, then you have already understood that healing cannot be hurried. These plants were never collected because they were rare, expensive, or powerful. They were protected because knowledge disappears when people keep it only for themselves. Hannah read on while Ethan listened in silence. Grace explained that she had planted the second garden as a living classroom for species that required patience and careful attention. She wrote that remedies should never replace proper medical care, and that anyone using plants without understanding their limits could cause harm instead of help. What mattered most, she said, was not possessing knowledge, but sharing it responsibly. Teach what you know. Admit what you do not. Never promise a cure when what someone needs is honesty, comfort, and time. Hannah paused over that line. During treatment, she had heard too many promises from strangers offering miracle diets, secret supplements, or certainty where none existed. Grace's words felt grounded and humane. The letter ended with one final instruction: protect the garden from those who would turn care into spectacle. Let it serve people quietly, or let it return to the earth. Ethan looked toward the surviving plants. That sounds like her. Before Hannah could answer, the distant sound of an engine reached them from the direction of the cottage. By the time they returned through the orchard, Richard Cole was waiting beside his SUV. He glanced at the mud on Hannah's boots and the map in her hand, but did not ask where she had been instead. He opened his portfolio and removed another document. I've reconsidered my offer, he said. This one is substantially higher. Hannah scanned the amount and felt her breath catch. The figure was enough to cover years of financial uncertainty and give her the comfortable beginning she had imagined after treatment. Richard watched her reaction carefully. You bought this place for $250? You could walk away with a return most investors would envy. Why raise the price so quickly? Hannah asked. Because the location fits my development plan, and because restoration costs will only increase. His gaze moved toward the garden. Whatever you've found here, I assure you it will be more valuable as part of a professionally managed property. Grace's letter rested inside Hannah's bag. Protect the garden from those who would turn care into spectacle. She handed the offer back. I'm still not selling. Richard's patience thinned. You may feel attached because of what you've survived, but attachment is not a business plan. The words struck more deeply than he intended. Hannah held his gaze. Neither is assuming everything has a price. Richard closed the portfolio. My offer will not remain open forever. Then it may expire. He left without another word. That afternoon, Hannah returned to the second garden alone. She sat on Grace's bench and read the letter again, this time paying attention to the seed packets inside the tin. Beneath them lay a small cloth pouch she had overlooked earlier. Inside was a delicate brass key, no longer than her smallest finger. A tiny leaf had been engraved into its head. Hannah turned it over in her palm and discovered a single word scratched along the stem. Journal. Hannah left the brass key in the cedar box beneath the shed floor. The word journal suggested it belonged to something important, but she had no idea what lock it opened, and forcing a discovery felt wrong after reading Grace's warning about patience. Instead, she returned to the names already written in the healer's journal. If the garden had truly served people, then the people or their families might explain what the missing pages could not. She began with Evelyn Hart, the widow mentioned near the front of the book. The county directory listed no current address, but Ethan remembered that Evelyn's daughter still lived in town. Her name was Clara Dawson, and she answered the door of a small blue house with suspicion until Hannah showed her a photograph of Grace's handwriting. Clara's expression softened immediately. My mother kept those teas for years, she said. Inside. She brought out a faded tin labeled lemon balm in Grace's careful script. Evelyn had stopped sleeping after her husband died. Doctors had offered medication, but she was afraid of becoming dependent on it. Grace never told her to refuse medical care. She simply sat with her through the first weeks of grief, prepared evening tea, and returned every few days to make certain she was eating. The tea helped, Clara said, turning the tin between her hands. But Mother always said it was Grace knocking on the door that saved her. Before Hannah left, Clara gave her a folded recipe card Grace had written for a simple soup made with garden herbs. On the back, one sentence read, "Nourishment is also medicine when someone has forgotten how to care for herself." The words followed Hannah as she drove to the second address on her list. Samuel Price had been a child when Grace recorded his recovery after a long fever. He now lived on a small farm outside town and walked with a cane. Though his memory remained sharp, when Hannah mentioned the old garden, he laughed. "Grace made the worst tasting tonic I ever swallowed." His wife smiled from across the kitchen. "You still tell everyone it saved your life." Samuel shook his head. "The doctors saved my life. Grace helped me become strong enough to feel alive again." He explained that his family had been poor and overwhelmed. Grace brought broth, herbs for steam, clean linens, and firewood. She stayed with his mother during the nights when his fever frightened them both. She never claimed the plants could perform miracles. Samuel said, "She believed care worked best when people stopped pretending one person had to carry everything alone." He showed Hannah a small wooden box containing dried seeds Grace had given him after he recovered. He had planted some every year since. By noon, Hannah understood that the journal entries recorded much more than remedies. Grace wrote about symptoms, plants, and preparation methods. But the families remembered meals, visits, listening, and dignity. The herbs had been part of the healing, never the whole of it. Her third visit took her to the Mercer family, whose name appeared several times across different years. Rose Mercer, now nearly 80, welcomed Hannah into a room filled with photographs. One showed Grace standing in the medicinal garden surrounded by 6 children. Each child held a plant cutting or seed packet. Grace stood at the edge of the group, smiling as though the moment belonged entirely to them. "She taught us every Saturday one summer," Rose said, "not because our parents could pay her. Most couldn't." Hannah studied the photograph. Behind Grace, the main garden looked orderly and bright, its paths clear, its beds carefully labeled. "What did she teach you? How to recognize plants, how to ask before taking, how to know when something was beyond our skill." Rose smiled. "She said the most dangerous healer was the one too proud to say, 'I don't know.'" That matched the letter from the second garden. Hannah turned the photograph over. On the back, Grace had written, "Knowledge kept only for oneself is another kind of neglect." Rose allowed Hannah to photograph it, but asked to keep the original before leaving. Hannah asked whether Grace had ever mentioned the missing journal pages. Rose's smile faded. "No, but there were years when people came to her in greater trouble than sickness." "What kind of trouble? Debt, hunger, violence at home?" "Grief people were ashamed to name." Rose glanced toward the photograph. Grace protected stories that weren't hers to share. The answer made Hannah think of the clean cuts in the journal. Perhaps the pages had been removed not to conceal a powerful remedy, but to protect people whose suffering had been recorded too honestly. She returned to the cottage before sunset carrying copies of 3 photographs, Grace's soup card, and a notebook filled with memories. Ethan was repairing a loose section of fence near the orchard. Hannah told him what she had learned. He listened without interrupting, then leaned against the post. "People remember what kindness felt like longer than they remember what was in the cup." "Did Grace ever know how much they remembered?" Hannah asked. She would have been embarrassed by the question. Ethan smiled, but sadness remained in his eyes. She didn't want gratitude to become a debt. That evening, Hannah spread the healer's journal, her notes, and the copied photographs across the cottage table. She began matching names to years and stories. Evelyn Hart, Samuel Price, the Mercer children. Each entry seemed ordinary until paired with the memory of someone who had lived through it. Then the record became something larger, a hidden history of people Grace had helped without demanding recognition. Hannah felt a quiet ache beneath her ribs, close to where surgery had left its permanent scar. During her own treatment, she had resented needing help. She had thanked nurses too quickly, rejected meals she needed, and apologized whenever someone drove her to an appointment. Grace's philosophy challenged the pride Hannah had once mistaken for strength. Receiving care had not made her weak. It had kept her alive. She continued working until the cottage windows reflected only darkness. Near midnight, she noticed a pattern she had missed before. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the journal, written beside different herbs, different years, and different kinds of hardship. Sometimes the entry mentioned a fever. Elsewhere it referred to sleeplessness, injuries, hunger, or fear. The name appeared too often to belong to a single patient, yet Grace had never added an age, address, family connection, or explanation. Hannah counted 17 entries across nearly 3 decades. Every other person had a story. This name had none. She copied it carefully into her notebook and stared at the 2 words Grace had written again and again. Mercy Vale. Hannah brought the healer's journal to Maya the next morning, along with the notebook page where she had copied every appearance of Mercy Vale. Maya set the journal beneath a magnifying lamp and examined the damaged section without touching the paper directly. "These pages were not torn out," she said after several minutes. "They were cut with a narrow blade." Hannah leaned closer. Fine fibers remained along the binding, too even to have resulted from age or accident. "Can you tell when?" "Not precisely, but the exposed paper has darkened almost as much as the page edges." "Which means this happened years ago." Maya photographed the cuts, then studied the entries before and after the missing section. Whoever removed them knew exactly what they wanted. They left the binding intact and avoided damaging the surrounding notes. Hannah showed her the repeated name. Maya traced the dates with one gloved finger. Mercy Vale appears during very different situations. Fever, injury, grief, food shortages. It may not have been one patient. That's what I thought. It could have been a name Grace used to protect people. Maya looked toward the missing pages. Especially if these entries involved circumstances more private than illness. Hannah remembered Rose Mercer's warning about debt. Hunger, violence, and grief people were ashamed to name. Can the remaining paper tell us what was written? Not enough. There are fragments near the inner edge, but no complete words. Maya adjusted the light and pointed to faint ink marks trapped close to the spine. One looked like the bottom of a capital letter. Another resembled part of a date. The best chance is outside the journal. If Grace helped people through public events, local records may show what happened during those years. They created a list of every date connected to Mercy Vale and every year surrounding the removed pages. Hannah drove to the county library, where old newspapers had been preserved on microfilm. The machine hummed as she moved through decades of local reports. She found harsh winters, crop failures, factory layoffs, house fires, and floods. Several dates matched the journal. In 1 year, a storm had destroyed 3 farmhouses near the Valley Road. Grace's entry from that month listed Mercy Vale beside calendula salve, clean bandages, and 6 nights without sleep. Another year showed the closure of a textile mill that had employed dozens of local families. The journal mentioned Mercyvale beside food parcels, lemon balm, and children too frightened to ask. Hannah wrote until her hand cramped. The pattern became clearer, but not simpler. Mercyvale seemed to appear whenever an entire family or group had needed help without wanting their names recorded. Near closing time, the librarian brought Hannah a box of county charity records that had never been digitized. Most documents listed churches, relief committees, and private donors. One folder contained handwritten reports from a community assistance group that had operated informally during the same years Grace kept the journal. Several distributions were marked with a short notation provided through MV. No address appeared. No donor was named. Hannah felt a brief surge of discovery, followed by frustration. Mercyvale might have been a person, an account, or a phrase Grace used privately. The records proved only that the initials existed beyond the journal. She requested the supporting documents, but the folder contained nothing else. Some pages were withdrawn before the archive was transferred here, the librarian explained. There's no note saying by whom. When Hannah returned to the medicinal garden, Ethan was repairing the gate to the second garden. He saw the county folders beneath her arm and immediately stopped working. Hannah noticed the change in his expression. It was not surprise. It was recognition. "You know what Mercyvale means," she said. Ethan lowered the hammer slowly. "Where did you find that name in Grace's journal? 17 times. And in county relief records as MV." He looked toward the cottage, then toward the trees surrounding the hidden beds. "You've been asking questions. I've been trying to understand what I bought. Some things were left hidden for a reason." Hannah opened the journal to the cut section. "Did Grace remove these pages?" Ethan's eyes settled on the narrow scars along the binding. He did not answer quickly enough. "You know who did," Hannah said. His shoulders seemed to sink beneath the weight of the question. "Yes." "Who Ethan placed the hammer on the fence post?" "I did." The answer struck Hannah harder than she expected. She had trusted him from the first afternoon when he warned her not to pull the garden apart before understanding it. Now she wondered how many warnings had been meant to protect Grace's secrets rather than help Hannah. "You cut pages out of her journal. At her request? Why?" "Because the names and details on those pages could have harmed people if they became public. Grace was already dying." Ethan's gaze dropped. She had grown weak. She knew she would not have time to decide who should inherit the records, and she feared the property would be sold to someone who saw only business. Hannah thought of Richard's plans for boutique cottages and a commercial wellness destination. "So you hid the truth." "I protected what she asked me to protect," and Mercyvale Ethan's expression tightened. "That was not one person." Hannah waited, but he offered nothing more. Anger rose beneath her exhaustion. "You told me Grace would be pleased someone came back. You told me the garden taught patient people. But you never told me you had taken part of its history, because patience also means knowing when information belongs to someone else. The journal belongs to me now. The paper does," Ethan said quietly. "The lives written on it do not." The distinction silenced her for a moment. She understood the truth in it. Yet the secrecy still felt like betrayal. "Where are the pages?" Ethan looked toward the cottage window where Grace's workroom faced the garden. "Safe. I need to see them. You may not feel that way after you understand what they contain. That should be my decision." Etten studied her face, perhaps searching for the impulsive stranger who had bought 4 neglected acres for $250. Hannah did not look away. "I spoke to the families Grace helped," she said. "I protected their stories. I didn't ask for names they didn't want shared. I know the difference between understanding a legacy and exposing someone's pain." Eaton's resistance softened. Though sorrow remained, Grace hoped the next keeper would understand that, then trust her choice. For a long time, only the wind moved through the trees. Finally, Ethan picked up the hammer, set it inside his tool basket, and closed the garden gate. "Come to my house tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll give you the missing pages." Hannah arrived at Ethan's house just after sunrise. The small farmhouse stood beyond the orchard, surrounded by apple trees and a fence patched so many times that no two boards matched. Ethan had left the front door unlocked. She found him in the kitchen beside a wooden case wrapped in an old wool blanket. Neither of them mentioned the argument from the previous evening. Ethan poured coffee, then rested both hands on the case. "Grace gave this to me 3 weeks before she died," he said. "She made me promise not to return the pages until someone understood why they were removed." Hannah sat across from him. "And you believe I understand?" "I believe you're beginning to." He unwrapped the case and opened its brass clasps. Inside, individual journal pages had been placed between sheets of clean paper. Their cut edges matched the narrow remains still bound inside the healer's journal. Hannah reached for the first page, then paused. "Are there names here that are still private?" "Yes." Ethan slid a folded sheet toward her. "I made a list of families whose descendants are still living nearby. Grace would not want their pain exposed without permission." Hannah closed the case again. "Then we read only what explains Mercy Vale." Relief softened his expression. Together they arranged the relevant pages across the table. The first began during the winter after the textile mill closed. Grace had written about 14 households without wages, parents skipping meals, and children suffering from coughs in homes too cold to heat. She prepared herbs for fever and sleeplessness, but her notes focused equally on food parcels, firewood, and quiet visits made after dark. Instead of listing every family, Grace placed them under one name, Mercy Vale. A later entry explained the choice. Mercy belongs to no single person. Vale belongs to everyone who calls this valley home. Let the name protect those who need help without turning their need into shame. Hannah read the sentence twice. The repeated name had never identified a secret patient. It represented anyone Grace helped anonymously when recording the truth might have caused harm. The following pages described storms, layoffs, domestic fear, addiction, grief, and families who could not afford medicine. There were no miracle cures. Grace repeatedly advised people to seek doctors, shelters, legal help, or hospital care when herbs were not enough. Her remedies offered comfort, strength, sleep, clean wounds, or nourishment, while practical assistance addressed the deeper crisis. She wasn't hiding a formula. Hannah whispered she was hiding people. Ethan nodded. Grace believed suffering should never become someone else's entertainment. One page contained a list of things she had sold to support Mercy Vale: dried herb bundles, seed packets, preserves, handmade salves, and eventually portions of the land itself. Hannah looked toward the window, beyond which the neglected garden stretched between the trees. Grace had not abandoned it because she stopped caring. She had exhausted its income helping others, then grown too weak to restore what remained. Everyone thought she let the place fail. Hannah said she let it become smaller so other lives could become larger. Ethan replied. The words left Hannah silent. She thought of her own fear after cancer treatment, when she had treated every offer of help as proof that illness had taken away her independence. Grace's pages showed a different kind of strength. Need did not diminish anyone. Shame did. Hannah read until late morning, stopping whenever an entry became too personal. She copied only the principles Grace repeated. Listen before offering advice. Never promise what plants cannot provide. Protect privacy. Share knowledge responsibly and treat practical care as part of healing. The missing pages did not contain secret medicine. They contained a philosophy built from thousands of ordinary choices. When Hannah finally closed the wooden case, Ethan placed a hand over it. "There is one more thing you should know. Richard Cole came to Grace years ago." Hannah looked up. "Why?" "His mother was raising him alone. She cleaned houses during the day and worked nights at the textile mill. When the mill closed, they nearly lost their home." Ethan opened one final page. Richard's family name did not appear. The entry was marked only Mercy Vale. Grace had delivered food, paid the overdue heating bill through the relief committee, and helped Richard's mother find work at a nearby nursery. "He knows," Hannah asked. "He knows Grace helped them. I'm not sure he knows how much she recorded." Later that afternoon, Richard arrived at the cottage while Hannah was returning the pages to the cedar box. He noticed the wooden case on the table and stopped. "Ethan gave them to you?" It was not a question. Hannah studied his face. "Your family was Mercy Vale." Richard's professional composure weakened. He closed the cottage door behind him. "For one winter, Grace kept you from losing your home. My mother believed accepting help was humiliating. Grace arranged everything through other people so no one would know." He glanced toward the garden. "She gave us food, medicine, and work. I promised myself I would never be powerless again." "So you learned to measure everything by ownership?" Richard's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. "I learned that good intentions disappear when there is no money to sustain them. Grace's intentions kept your family alive and left this property collapsing." His words were blunt, but his voice carried grief rather than contempt. "I wanted to buy the garden because I thought commercial success could preserve what she built. By turning it into a wellness resort, by making it profitable enough that no one could neglect it again." Hannah understood him more clearly now. Richard was not trying to erase Grace's legacy. He was trying to control it because control had once protected him from fear. Yet his plan would transform private compassion into an attraction sold to strangers. "The garden's value isn't in rare plants," she said. "It's in how Grace used them." Richard looked at the wooden case. "Kindness does not repair roofs or pay taxes. Neither does exploiting the stories of people who trusted her." He had no answer. After he left, Hannah carried the healer's journal to the shed and placed the missing pages inside the cedar box. While closing the compartment, she remembered the small brass key engraved with the word journal. She took it from its cloth pouch and examined the cedar box more carefully. Beneath the journal lay a fitted wooden tray. The key opened a tiny lock hidden along its edge. The tray lifted, revealing a larger iron key and a hand-drawn symbol matching a door marked at the farthest corner of Grace's property map. The symbol on Grace's map led Hannah beyond the second garden to the oldest edge of the property, where a low stone wall disappeared beneath ivy and fallen branches. She returned the next morning with Ethan carrying the map, the iron key, a flashlight, and enough tools to clear whatever blocked the way. The marked location appeared to point toward an empty section of woodland. But Ethan remembered that a narrow storage building had once stood there before trees grew around it. They searched along the wall until Hannah found a rusted hinge buried beneath moss. Together they pulled away vines, loose soil, and several rotting boards. Slowly, the outline of a small wooden door emerged from the earth and vegetation. It had been built directly into the slope. Almost like the entrance to an old root cellar, a grape leaf symbol had been carved into the center, matching the one drawn on Grace's map. The lock was thick with rust. Hannah pushed the iron key inside, but it would not turn. Ethan worked oil into the mechanism while she cleared packed dirt from the threshold. After several attempts, the key moved with a deep scrape. The door opened only a few inches before something caught behind it. They pressed together until a fallen shelf shifted across the floor, releasing a breath of cool, dry air scented with cedar, paper, and old herbs. Inside, the narrow room extended farther into the hillside than Hannah expected. Shelves lined both walls from floor to ceiling. Wooden boxes had been stacked carefully according to year. Glass jars held dried seeds labeled in Grace's handwriting. Bundles of paper wrapped in linen filled another cabinet. The room contained no treasure in any ordinary sense, yet Hannah immediately understood that everything Grace had tried to preserve was here. Ethan remained near the doorway, visibly moved. "She never showed me this place," he said. Hannah lifted the first box onto a central work table. Inside were notebooks older than the healer's journal, some written by Grace and others in handwriting that appeared to belong to earlier gardeners. They contained planting charts, weather records, soil observations, recipes for salves and teas, and warnings about plants that could become dangerous if used incorrectly. Grace had added corrections in the margins whenever later knowledge changed her understanding. Nothing was presented as unquestionable truth. Each page reflected years of testing, learning, and admitting uncertainty. A second box held letters from families throughout the valley. Some thanked Grace for meals brought during illness. Others described seeds she had shared after gardens failed. Several contained no names, only initials or the mark MV. Hannah did not open those. She placed them aside, respecting the same privacy Grace had protected in the missing pages. Farther along the wall, she discovered shallow drawers filled with seed packets. Each packet listed the plant, collection date, original bed, and conditions needed for germination. Some seeds were probably too old to grow, but others had been sealed with wax and stored inside metal containers. She planned for the garden to continue, Hannah said. Ethan ran one hand across the labels. Even when she knew she might not. The practical scale of Grace's work humbled Hannah. This was not the collection of a woman chasing secret cures. It was an archive built by someone afraid knowledge might vanish if it remained in one person's memory. There were teaching cards designed for children, simple guides for families who could not afford reference books, and lists of local doctors, nurses, shelters, and legal services. Grace had linked every herbal note to a reminder that serious illness required professional care. In one folder, Hannah found a page titled, "What the Garden Cannot Do," beneath it. Grace had listed cancer, severe infections, internal injuries, pregnancy complications, and other conditions that should never be treated with herbs alone. Hannah's chest tightened as she read the word cancer. She thought of the fear that had followed her diagnosis and the strangers who had offered miracle remedies as though desperation made every claim acceptable. Grace's honesty felt more healing than any false promise. Maya arrived before noon after Hannah called to explain the discovery. She entered the hidden room wearing gloves and carrying archival supplies. Her excitement was immediate but controlled. "This collection could be historically important," she said, examining a planting ledger. "But more than that, it's responsible." Grace documented what worked, what failed, and where traditional knowledge had limits. Hannah showed her the sealed seed containers and the older notebooks. Maya advised against moving anything until humidity and insect damage could be assessed. They photographed each shelf, numbered the boxes, and made a temporary inventory. The work took hours. Every discovery answered one question while adding practical concerns. The cellar door needed weatherproofing. Several boxes required professional conservation. Some labels had begun to fade. Hannah's small savings would not cover everything. Even so, the room no longer felt like a burden she had accidentally purchased. It felt like a trust. Near the back, Ethan found a wooden cabinet secured by a simple latch. Inside were photographs of the garden across 4 decades. Grace appeared beside school children, grieving widows, farm workers, and families carrying baskets of herbs. In nearly every image, she stood at the edge rather than the center. One photograph showed Richard as a thin boy beside his mother, both holding seed trays. Hannah turned it over. Grace had written, "New beginnings should be offered without debt." Ethan looked away, giving her privacy as she absorbed the meaning. Richard's desire to control the property had grown from a childhood shaped by receiving help he could never repay. Grace had never asked him to repay it. She had only expected him to understand it. Maya opened another cabinet and discovered folders labeled Teaching Garden, Community Care, and Future Keeper. The last contained plans for restoring the grounds as a place where people could learn about medicinal plants safely, without turning the garden into a clinic or promising cures. Grace had sketched outdoor classrooms, accessible paths, and demonstration beds. The plans were incomplete, but their purpose was clear. She had imagined the garden continuing as a shared source of knowledge rather than a private collection. By late afternoon, Hannah's exhaustion gave way to quiet certainty. The final room had not revealed a hidden fortune or a miraculous formula. It had revealed the structure beneath Grace's kindness, careful records, preserved seeds, honest limits, and a belief that healing required both knowledge and humility. As Maya packed the most fragile papers into protective sleeves, Hannah noticed a small shelf beneath the work table. A portable cassette recorder rested there, under a linen cover. Beside it lay several unused batteries and one cassette in a clear plastic case. Grace's handwriting appeared on the label. "For the one who tends the garden after me." Hannah lifted the tape with both hands. Ethan grew silent. Maya stopped working and looked toward her. The recorder appeared old but intact. Hannah inserted the batteries, placed the cassette inside, and lowered her finger toward the play button. Knowing Grace's voice had been waiting in the darkness for whoever finally chose to listen. The cassette clicked once, and for several seconds the hidden room held only the soft hiss of turning tape. Then Grace Holloway's voice emerged, thin with age but steady. "To the person tending this garden after me," Grace began, "I hope you found the plants before you found this recording. A garden should introduce itself through what is still alive." Hannah closed her eyes. Ethan lowered his head, while Maya stood motionless beside the shelves. Grace explained that she had hidden the archive because knowledge could be damaged as easily by greed as by neglect. She had seen people sell false promises to the sick, using words like natural and ancient to make desperation sound like proof. The garden, she said, had never been a place of miracles. It had been a place where people were fed, listened to, comforted, and guided toward proper help when herbs were not enough. "The journal contains names because I was afraid stories would disappear." Grace continued, "The pages were removed because preserving a story does not always mean revealing it. Mercyvale was the name I gave to suffering that belonged to no stranger's curiosity." The recording continued with simple instructions: preserve the seeds, correct old knowledge when better knowledge appears, teach children the difference between care and cure, and never let the garden become a stage for anyone's pride. Grace admitted that the land had grown difficult to maintain as her health failed. She had sold produce, remedies, and pieces of property to support families during hard years, but refused businesses that wanted to market her work as something mystical. "If the garden survives," she said, "let it survive honestly. If it cannot, let it return to the earth without shame." After a pause, her voice softened. "You owe me nothing. Care is not a debt passed from one person to another. But if this place has given you courage, give someone else room to find theirs." The tape ended with a mechanical click. Tears slipped down Hannah's face, but the feeling beneath them was not only grief. After cancer treatment, she had believed survival should have made her certain. Instead, she had felt lost and ashamed. Grace's message offered no command to become heroic. It offered permission to care without pretending she could control every outcome. Ethan finally spoke. She recorded that near the end. His voice broke slightly. I never heard it. Hannah looked at him. You protected all of this without knowing what she said? I knew what she lived. Maya carefully removed the cassette and placed it inside an archival sleeve. By the following day, Hannah had decided the valley deserved to know what Grace had built, though not the private details she had guarded. With Maya's help, she prepared copies of selected journal pages, seed records, and photographs that contained no sensitive names. Ethan contacted families who had known Grace. Hannah invited them to the medicinal garden on Saturday afternoon. She expected perhaps a dozen visitors. More than 40 arrived. They gathered beneath the old apple trees, some carrying photographs, seed packets, recipes, or letters Grace had once sent. Hannah stood beside a small table where the closed healer's journal rested. Grace Holloway kept records of this garden for decades, she began, but those records were never only about plants. She described the second garden, the preserved seeds, the teaching notes, and the practical help offered through Mercyvale. She explained that the name had protected people facing illness, hunger, grief, debt, and fear. She did not identify a single family. The missing pages will remain private, she said. No one's hardest moment will be displayed as proof of someone else's goodness. Silence followed. Then Clara Dawson stepped forward, holding her mother's faded lemon balm tin. My mother always thought Grace helped only her. Samuel Price raised his cane. So did we. One by one, others spoke. A woman remembered groceries left after her father lost work. A retired teacher described Grace providing winter coats while pretending they came from a school donation. A farmer recalled seedlings arriving after floodwater destroyed his family's garden. The stories connected across decades, revealing a community that had survived through acts of care most recipients believed were isolated. They had carried one another without always knowing it. Richard arrived after the gathering began and remained near the gate until Hannah finished. When the crowd quieted, he stepped forward. My family was recorded under Mercyvale, he said, when the textile mill closed. My mother and I nearly lost our home. Grace paid our heating bill through the relief committee, brought food, and found my mother work. He looked toward the overgrown beds. I spent most of my life believing the only way to protect something was to own it, control it, and make it profitable. That is why I wanted this property. Hannah waited. I told myself a wellness resort would preserve Grace's work, he continued, but I was turning private kindness into a commercial story. I understand that now. Then Rose Mercer asked the question everyone seemed to be holding. What happens to the garden? Hannah looked toward the cottage roof. Broken fencing, crowded beds, and hidden archive requiring money she did not have. Before she could answer, offers came from every side. Samuel knew a carpenter. Clara volunteered to organize meals. Families offered tools, labor, plants, and donations. Maya proposed a preservation plan and educational partnership. Even Richard said he would help, without ownership or naming rights. Hannah listened as the impossible work divided itself into practical pieces. Yet one decision remained hers alone. That evening, after the last visitor left, she stood beneath the Holloway sign with Richard's purchase offer in one hand and Grace's garden map in the other, knowing that by morning she would have to choose whether to sell the land or become its next keeper. At dawn, Hannah carried Richard's purchase offer to the kitchen table and placed it beside the healer's journal. The amount on the page could have paid her debts, repaired the cottage, and given her the kind of security she had craved since cancer stripped certainty from her life. For several minutes, she imagined accepting it. She could leave before the garden demanded more than she knew how to give. She could call the last weeks an unusual detour and return to a life measured by salary, schedules, and controlled outcomes. Then she opened the journal to Grace's words. Care is not a debt passed from one person to another. Hannah took Richard's offer outside, crossed the wet grass to the old stone fire ring, and held one corner to a match. The paper curled slowly, blackened, and became ash. Ethan watched from the orchard path without speaking. When the flame died, Hannah said, "I'm keeping it." He nodded once. "Then we should start with the roof before the next rain." The first weeks of restoration were neither graceful nor inspiring. They were filled with splinters, mud, broken tools, and lists longer than Hannah's patience. Samuel's carpenter replaced damaged beams in the shed. Clara organized lunches for the volunteers. Rose helped identify families in old photographs without revealing stories that belonged to them. Maya supervised the archive, moving fragile notebooks into protective boxes and teaching Hannah how to record temperature, moisture, and insect damage. Richard arrived with a truck of lumber and no company signs. When Hannah asked who had paid for it, he said only someone who owed Grace nothing. She accepted the answer. The hardest work involved deciding what the garden would become. Some visitors wanted remedies for serious illnesses. Others arrived expecting rare plants with hidden powers. Hannah refused to sell certainty. At the entrance, she posted Grace's rule in plain lettering. "This garden teaches care. It does not promise cures." Maya helped create signs explaining safe uses, risks, and the importance of professional medical treatment. The bed of foxglove carried the largest warning. The chamomile and lemon balm beds included simple histories, but no claims that comfort could replace medicine. When a man demanded to know which herb had cured Hannah's cancer, she met his disappointment without anger. "Surgery, chemotherapy, skilled doctors, and people who stayed beside me," she said. "The garden helped me understand what surviving meant afterward." The answer spread through the community, repeated more often than any dramatic legend would have been. By autumn, the main paths were clear. The second garden remained protected behind its repaired gate, open only for guided lessons. Several of Grace's sealed seeds germinated under Maya's supervision. Others did not. And Hannah recorded each failure as carefully as each success. Grace would approve, Maya said while they examined an empty tray. Of the failure of telling the truth about it, Ethan restored the cottage workroom but refused to replace Grace's scarred table. Hannah cleaned it, sealed the wood, and placed the healer's journal beneath a glass cover that could be lifted for supervised study. The missing pages stayed in their wooden case. Families could request access to their own records, but no private story was displayed. Mercy Vale became the name of a community fund, managed publicly and given quietly. It paid for food, transportation to medical appointments, heating bills, and emergency repairs. No recipient was required to tell a story in exchange for help. Richard handled the legal structure without charging a fee. He never asked for his name on the garden. One cold afternoon, Hannah found him standing before the photograph of himself and his mother holding seed trays. "I thought success meant never needing anyone again," he said. Grace understood that everyone needs someone eventually. Hannah stood beside him. "Maybe success is becoming the person who stays." He looked at her, then back at the photograph. "You stayed." The words settled more deeply than praise. Hannah had spent years believing her life divided into before cancer and after cancer, as though illness had stolen the person she was supposed to remain. The garden taught her that survival was not a return. It was a continuation shaped by what she chose to carry forward. In spring, nearly a year after the auction, the medicinal garden opened its gates as a community teaching garden and archive. There was no grand stage. Children planted calendula beside rows. Samuel demonstrated how Grace had taught him to save seeds. Clara served the soup from her mother's recipe card. Maya led a lesson on the limits of herbal medicine. Ethan stood near the orchard, pretending not to be proud while correcting anyone who stepped too close to the young beds. Hannah welcomed visitors beneath a new wooden sign, Holloway Garden of Care and Memory. The original weathered sign hung below it, its faded letters preserved rather than repainted. Before the first tour, Hannah played a short portion of Grace's recording. She chose only the words intended for everyone. If this place has given you courage, give someone else room to find theirs. No one applauded immediately. The silence felt more respectful than celebration. Then the work began. People carried watering cans, labeled beds, repaired benches, and shared what they knew. Nothing miraculous happened. No incurable disease vanished. No hidden fortune was uncovered beneath the soil. Yet the garden changed lives in smaller, believable ways. An exhausted daughter found transportation for her father's appointments. A widower learned to cook the soup Clara taught each month. Teenagers helped preserve old seed records. Families facing hardship received assistance without public shame. Children learned that a plant could be useful, dangerous, beautiful, or all three at once. At sunset, after the visitors left, Hannah walked alone through the paths. The herbs moved softly in the evening wind. She paused beside the bed where lemon balm had returned, thick and bright, then continued to the second garden. She no longer entered it searching for answers. She entered to check the soil, inspect the labels, and notice what needed care. Ethan found her kneeling beside a young plant grown from one of Grace's sealed packets. "You know," he said, "people still tell the story wrong." Hannah brushed soil from her hands. "What do they say? That you bought a worthless garden for $250 and found a healer's secret journal?" She smiled. "That's close enough to bring them through the gate." And when they arrived, Hannah looked across the restored beds, the cottage archive, and the lights glowing where volunteers were finishing the day's records. "Then we tell them the truth." She returned the journal to its cedar box that night, not to hide it, but to protect it. On the final page, beneath Grace's last entry, Hannah added one sentence in her own handwriting. "The garden continues, and no one tends it alone." She closed the cover, listened to the familiar sounds of the cottage settling around her, and understood at last what Grace had left behind. It was not a cure, a treasure, or a secret meant to make one person powerful. It was proof that ordinary care, offered honestly and preserved with humility, could outlive the person who began it. If this story leaves us with one lesson, it is that true healing has never been about miracles. It has always been about people. Grace's greatest legacy wasn't a secret remedy hidden inside an old journal, but the quiet choice to show up for others with honesty, compassion, and humility. Hannah discovered that surviving life's hardest battles is only the beginning. What truly transforms us is how we use that second chance to care for those around us. In a world that often celebrates grand achievements, this forgotten garden reminds us that the smallest acts of kindness, a warm meal, a listening ear, a helping hand, or shared knowledge can echo through generations. We may never know how far our compassion will travel, but like seeds planted with patience, it can continue growing long after we're gone.